Okay, so we've decided that we are not souls, or at least that's the message of the previous video. So then what are we? And this is an important question for various reasons. What is it that we care about continuing to exist in the future? For example, everything we do in life, it tends to be future directed. You come to school so that you can get a good job in the future. So you care about you in the future. You're working really hard for the you in the future. And the question is, what makes that being in the future you? What is it that you share in common? One common suggestion is souls, and we've decided that that doesn't work. So what's the alternative? This is the topic that is usually referred to under the heading personal identity in philosophy, and it's a favorite topic of mine. I've done a bunch of videos on it. That's a slightly misleading title because it assumes that we are persons, and I'll say a little bit about persons in a second, which is used in a slightly technical sense in philosophy. It's not the same as just people. Whereas there is a significant number of people, including the author of one of the articles I had you read, which is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Personal Identity. That guy, Eric Olson, doesn't believe that we, each of us, is a person. I'll qualify that, but he doesn't think that that's at rock bottom what we are. He ascribes to something called animalism, and he says basically we're a living organism. That's what we are. All right, so perhaps better than saying we're talking about personal identity, say we're addressing the question, who am I? Now, I've made the main question, what am I, which is slightly clearer, because who am I can be confused with a different question. And this is a distinction that Olson makes in the article. He says, one common way of understanding the who am I question is what a philosopher called Maria Schechtman calls the characterization question. That is, this seems to be something that comes up all the time in Disney movies now. For example, if you've seen Encanto, or your kids have seen Encanto about 10 billion times, there's a song sung by the big muscular daughter, and one of the lines is, who am I if I can't be doing this? You know, so she's losing her strength, and she's worried that in losing her strength, she's losing herself, because she was sort of defined as the strong one. That's the characterization question. I don't even know who I am. That's not the question that we're interested in here. That's the question that someone undergoing a personality crisis might ask, as she does in the song. But the personal identity question, the one that we're interested in, is the kind of question where if you wake up in hospital and you've completely lost your memory, there's a show called The Tourist on HBO where that happens to a guy, and you ask, who am I? You literally don't know the individual that existed in the past. Now, as we'll see, if we take one particular version of the personal identity, an amnesiac actually doesn't have anybody in the past. It's as if they're born when they wake up. But you get the idea. What individual is me, not you know, what are my values, which is the personality crisis kind of question. All right, so why is it called personal identity? Well, a lot of this debate owes to a guy called John Locke, who was around in the 1600s and was very influential on a number of topics, in particular this debate. And he made a distinction that basically mirrors these two columns. He says we have a physical element, we have our bodies, but we also have psychological element. And he said that the psychological identity, or the identity defined in terms of psychology, is what he calls a person. And the identity defined in terms of biology is, well, he calls it man, but he means human. So most of us are both of those things, a human and a person. But all of us at some stage in our life, like me, focusing on me, this, at some stage in its existence, was not a person. So, for example, if you date the beginning of this to the conception when, sperm met the egg, if you say that's the moment that this began to exist, well, then this existed for a while. It's definitely human. I wasn't the product of non-humans, I promise. But it's not a person. Because according to Locke, a person is somebody capable of consciousness. Consciousness is very important. Awareness, being able to think. Now, what degree of sophistication of thinking? That's a question we're not really going to get into in this section, because that's a debate that people writing on abortion often get into. They say, is the fetus a person yet? Or when does the fetus become a person? When does it acquire the status that gives it rights? Because one thing that Locke said is that the notion of person, unlike the notion of biological organism, is tied up with moral notions. So, for example, it's the person, it's you as a person who deserves praise or blame. And in bioethics, it's persons who can have moral standing. So, for example, a mosquito. That's definitely a living thing, but it's not a person because we assume it doesn't have sophisticated consciousness enough. So in killing a mosquito, you are not committing murder. Whereas if you killed me, you would be committing murder because I'm a person, I have a sophisticated psychology, and that gives me moral status. Now, persons are different from humans because, in theory, you could have non-human persons. If E.T. really existed, then if you killed E.T., that would be as bad as killing me. It would be murder. A more interesting question, because this was a real living thing, was Coco the gorilla, who learned sign language. You can look her up on YouTube. I don't think she's still alive. And had a pet kitten, and was friends with Robin Williams, I believe. And when informed that Robin Williams had died, signed that she was sad because, she liked Robin Williams. So does Coco meet the level of sophistication so that she's a fully fledged person and has rights? That's an interesting question that we're not going to get into in this section. So you can have non-human persons, and also you can have human non-persons like the fetus, or imagine if during my biological existence something terrible happens to me, like what happened to Nancy Cruzan, or more recently Terry Schiavo. A catastrophic brain injury happens and it destroys my cerebrum, the big stuff at the front of your brain where consciousness happens. That gets destroyed by a brain bleed or something like that, and I'm no longer capable of consciousness. Well, then I would stop being a person because I would no longer have the requirements of being a person, the consciousness, but I would continue to exist as a living thing. As Nancy Cruzan, for example, was kept alive at least 7 years on a ventilator as her parents argued for the right to unplug her. This was a famous case. And then eventually you die and your body starts to decompose. Nancy Cruzan and Terry Schiavo, their body definitely wasn't decomposing. Her heart was pumping, her lungs were working, she was taking in nutrients and so on. It's just that she couldn't think. So that would be an example of someone who was definitely human, but not a person. Okay, so all of us have this stage, if we count our beginnings as at conception, where we are definitely a human organism of some kind, but we are not a person. anencephaly is a condition that some babies are born with where literally they don't have the part of the brain capable of consciousness. Sometimes their head literally ends here and there's nothing above it. Sometimes they have a fully formed head, but it's just hollow. You can literally shine a light through and see the light on the other side. It's just fluid there. And they can breathe. They can, their hearts, all of this stuff works. They're warm and alive, but it's just incapable of feeling anything. If you poked a pin in them, their body would jerk, but they wouldn't be having pain because they don't have the part of the brain capable of it. They would be human non-persons. Okay, so the question of persons is tied into the notion of personal identity. What makes one person the same person as a previous person? But that's only one part of the question we're interested in, particularly if, like Olson, you believe what I am essentially the organism. So for example, what Locke seemed to believe is that the most important thing that I am is the person. That's more important than being the human. And later people influenced by Locke would say that I am essentially a person. That is, if I cease to become a person, like here, then I cannot continue to exist. Your essential properties are things that if something lacks them, then it's not you. So if, for example, I stopped being capable of consciousness, I would no longer exist. I would end here, according to people who say we're essentially persons. On Olson's view, like other animalists, is no. I would continue to exist as a non-person. So my essential feature is being a living organism, according to animalists. So this is a debate. Who's right? Which is the more, what am I? Am I an animal or am I a person? And what exactly does it take to be a person? Well, one way to get at this issue is by talking about persistence conditions. Okay, that's the question of how is it that something, anything, you can talk about persistent conditions for anything. How is it that something continues to exist? A famous persistence condition question from ancient philosophy is the question of the ship of Theseus. Okay, so the story of the ship of Theseus is it's a wooden ship and it starts off from a port in Greece and sets off to sail the world and do mythical things like those guys did. And the ship of Theseus departs from a port in Greece and like a few years later arrives back. But in the meantime, every single plank on the ship has been replaced because it crashes on rocks all the time and you patch the hole and then a different part gets knocked out and you patch that hole. So according to the story, there are no planks in common when it comes back in. The ship that comes back into port has no planks in common with the ship that left it. Then the question is it the same ship? That is a question that can be answered if you know the persistence conditions for a ship. Does a ship have to be made of at least some of the same wood to be the same ship? Well, we're not really interested in persistence conditions for ships, but we are interested in persistence conditions for us. What are our persistence conditions? So that's the question of what makes me as a baby, me as an adult. Apparently I'm wearing a suit. That must have been when I interviewed for this job, because that's the only time I've ever worn a suit. And me as an old geezer wearing a walker with the little tennis balls on the feet, as they always seem to have. What is it that all of these have in common? How is it that this is a continuation of this, is a continuation of this? What makes that true? Okay, now, this is the question that they're trying to get at in the chapter with the cartoons in, from Stephen Law's book, The Philosophy Files. And his example is Fred and Bert. So Fred and Bert, Fred is a little skinny guy, Bert is a giant 6'5" tubby guy with a wooden leg. All right. What happens to them is that aliens come and swap their brains, okay? Hence this. And these are meant to indicate the two hemispheres, because you have two hemispheres of your brain, which will be important later on. Okay, so Fred and Bert have their brains swapped. And then the question is, this is a way of getting at what we really believe. So whether you know it or not, you have beliefs about what makes you you. And one way to get at what those beliefs are is to do what's called a little thought experiment that, isn't possible yet, where your brains get swapped around. If that were to happen, so that, and Fred, probably you could do it, but they wouldn't live, all right? But in this case, the brains are swapped and then they're connected up perfectly to the body, so Fred can walk around, so this body can walk around and this body can walk around. If this happened, what would happen is that this person, who was Fred, would think that he was Bert. Why? Because he's got Bert's brains, which contain all of his memories and self-perception. So this person would wake up, say, why am I in a completely new house? Go and look in the mirror and be astonished to see the wrong face looking back at him, because he's expecting to see this face. And conversely, of course, this person would be amazed to see that he's taller, has a wooden leg, and is much heavier. So if you ask this person after the operation what their name was, they would say their name was Bert. And if you ask this person, they would say their name was Fred. Okay. Who is this person now? Who is this individual? Again, I use the term person, which is confusing. Who is this individual? If you believe that essentially we are living organisms, then the brain transfer is like an organ transfer, and it doesn't affect you. So, for example, if I were to have a heart transplant, I hope I wouldn't, because that's pretty serious. But if I were to have a heart transplant, that wouldn't stop me being me. I would continue to exist. I would be the same individual. I would continue to be Simon Cushing after the heart transplant. Because there's enough of me that's the same that would make it still me. That's the thing about organisms. If you believe that you are essentially an organism, you're not saying that what makes this the same as this and this the same as this is being made of the same stuff. You can't say that, because this is not made of the same cells as this. This is not made of the same cells as this. It's a biological fact that we shed cells all the time and we grow new ones. So it's like the ship of Theseus being rebuilt slowly all the time. And it's something like after 8 years, you've got none of the same cells except some cells in your brain, I believe. And because as somebody once described human beings, or all living things really, as slow motion fountains. In other words, like fountains take in water, squirt it out, take in new water. We're doing that with cells. We take in food, the food gets turned into new cells, old cells die and drop off. Most of household dust is human skin cells, because we're shedding it all the time. Okay, so if you believe that these are all the same individual, you're not saying what makes you the same individual is being made of the same stuff. So what is it? The answer that John Locke gave, and that the animalists have to work with, is that in some sense it's the same life. So when an organism starts, it's a single life that animates it. Now, that life can be transferred to new cells. So you can acquire inanimate matter by eating it, and then it gets turned into new cells which join to the living thing, like an apple growing on an apple tree. So atoms that previously were not alive and were not part of you are somehow sucked into the system that is you and acquires life. But it's the same life. And then this one life that animates you lasts your entire existence. So it starts here and ends here, according to the animalist. Now, I think this is a pretty strange notion that animalists really need to explain, because actually, there's all sorts of living things going on inside you, where it's a really open question whether or not they're part of you. Like your gut is full of bacteria that if they weren't there, you couldn't digest and you would die. But are the bacteria part of you? Do they partake of your life? Or do they each individually have their own little life? That's a question that the animalists, I think, need to answer, because I want to know, are those bacteria part of me? Who am I or what am I? Do I include those bacteria? Where do I end? Do I include just the follicles of my hair, or as the end of my hair? What about my fingernails? Are they still alive? Are they part of me? This is a question that an animalist could get into. But anyway, you get the basic idea that the animalist says. I am a living thing. So according to the animalist, this, before and after the brain transplant, this is the same individual, because the brain is like a heart. It's not big enough to make a difference. The organism has been disrupted not enough for it to stop being the same. So according to the animalists, these don't change after the operation. This starts out as Fred, it finishes as Fred. Now, Fred thinks he's Bert, but he's wrong, according to the animalist. Now, this example, which owes a lot to an example that Locke gave. He didn't talk about brain transplants. He just imagined, basically Locke invented Freaky Friday. If you know Freaky Friday, they've made 3 versions of it now. The original one is Jodie Foster is the kid, and I've forgotten who the mother is, and they wake up one day and they've swapped bodies. Now, putting it that way, swapping bodies, immediately betrays that you're not an animalist, because an animalist would say you cannot swap bodies, you are a body. So you can't swap the thing that makes you you. But that's exactly what we feel about Freaky Friday. The premise of Freaky Friday is that the one in the mother's body is Jodie Foster, is the kid, and so on. And that is just our intuition. Thought experiments like this, just the vast majority of people say, oh yeah, they've swapped bodies. So animalism is up against it there, because it seems to give the wrong answer that goes against the vast majorities of people's intuitions in cases like this. Locke didn't call it Freaky Friday. He imagined a prince and a cobbler basically doing a Freaky Friday. Okay, so let's... so if you say that one is now Bert after the operation, then you are saying you're taking a psychological view. Or possibly you're taking a physical view, but you're saying Bert is just his brain. Bert is not the whole organism. Maybe Bert is just the brain. So if you say that, then obviously Bert goes where the brain goes, and this is just sort of the support system for the brain. So there is a biological view that gets the right answer, or the answer that most people think about the brain swap case. But that one wouldn't get the right answer if it's not the brains that are being transplanted, it's just the contents of the brain. If you read the Stephen Law, he imagines, okay, suppose the aliens don't swap the brains, but they suck out all of the memories and personality and transfer all of the sort of programming of the brain and swap that around. Then this wouldn't get the right answer. And we would say, most of us would probably still say in that case that the one who now says that he's Bert is right. He is Bert. And in that case, the only way to explain that is if what makes us us is our psychological features. So, Locke says that's what's most important about us, that we are the person. We are the thing that we think we are. In other words, the way to work out who somebody is they're the only true judge. Because suppose we did not the brain transplant, but the memory transplant. The only people who would be able to tell that it had happened would be Fred and Bert. No doctor examining them would know that anything had changed. So if the way to tell who is physical, it must be externally verifiable, then the person saying, but now I'm Bert in this body, you would say, no, you aren't, because nothing's physical has changed. Whereas if you believe that what makes you is your psychology, it's only the first person perspective that is the right one. So it would actually literally be impossible to tell for anyone else that this had happened, as in Freaky Friday. Except, well, they would tell, the evidence would be that, as in Freaky Friday, that the mother starts acting like the daughter and the daughter. So it would be behavioral, but there wouldn't be any biological test that would reveal it. Okay, so if I am a person, that sounds right. When we do thought experiments like this, it seems to, Locke wins most of us over. He would say, see, you agree that you go where the person goes. Now, Locke recognized that this view, that I am essentially my person, so I didn't begin at conception. I began when I started to be conscious. That has some strange implications. Now, that doesn't mean that they're so strange that he's going to reject them. He's going to say, look, it's obviously true, so we're going to find out some weird stuff. Okay, so the weird implications about if we're a person is one. Well, the first one is, I was never born. Okay, if I am a person, then I go back as far as my consciousness goes, and certainly I was never conceived. So, or if you look at the first trimester of me as a fetus, and if there was an ultrasound of back then I would say, well, that's not me, because it's not conscious. It turns into me later on. It's a thing that turns into me, but it's not me. Well, I don't find that strange, because, you know, if for some reason, well, suppose I was a product of IVF, and IVF means the sperm and the egg are joined together in a lab. Well, suppose somebody took a high-resolution photo of the sperm and the egg before they're joined together. Then that would be before conception, and I would say, well, those are things that turned into me, but they're not me. And I would say the same about the fetus. So, you know, not necessarily that strange. Here's some weirder stuff. You can have one human, but many persons. Obviously, we've all heard of cases of multiple personality, like the movie Split. I don't know if that ever actually happens, but if it did, and each personality had no conscious connection with any of the others, they couldn't access their memories or any features like that, then you would have different persons living in the same human. If you've seen the excellent Apple TV show Severance, and if you haven't, see it because it's excellent, that gives another way that you could have two persons. The plot is, and actually the idea of Severance is to be found in Locke as well. He imagines a case where a man at night remembers all of the nights, and the same human during the day remembers all of the days, but neither of them, the day man doesn't remember the nights and the night man doesn't remember the days, so they have no overlap. That would be two different persons. And Locke, being a Christian, would believe that if they died, you'd need two people going to the afterlife, because they're two separate beings. So one coffin, two people arrive in the afterlife. Maybe one goes to hell, one goes to heaven. Severance imagines this done with a chip in your brain, so that people at work only exist at work and have no memories of the outside world, and people of the outside world have no memories of at work. And those are two different persons. And in Severance, the one at work grows to hate the person that inhabits her body, oops, I gave it away, outside, and threatens to kill the body because it will kill the outside person as well. It's a great show. You got to see it. So that's one weird implication. Another implication that Locke described, you know, he was aware of this, is if I commit a crime and then I don't remember it, then I didn't do it. I'm not guilty of it. So I could be covered in blood, holding the knife, And there could be a film of me stabbing somebody repeatedly and then suddenly doing this and going like this. And if at that moment all of my memories were wiped, you can't punish me because I didn't do it. Who did do it? The person who was stabbing, but it's not the same one. Why? Well, this is where the persistence conditions of persons comes in. Because the question can be asked, if I am a person, what makes me now the same person as me 10 minutes ago? I know what makes me the same animal. It's the same organism, you know, the same cells and so on. You know, with the proviso that you can shed a few. But what makes me the same person? Now, early interpreters of Locke said it's memory. So, and Locke is not very clear on this. So, and it's easy to interpret him as saying this. So, in other words, what makes this person the same as this person, the same as this person, is there has to be memory links. So, in order for this to be this person, he has to remember him, and he has to remember him. Now, of course, he is unlikely to remember him because this is a baby, and I don't remember being a baby. My earliest memories are about age 5. So that suggests that, first of all, I came into existence. If what makes me the same person as memory is I came into existence age 5. Who was it that was around before? I don't know, it wasn't me. Was this another person that had my body for like the first 5 years? That's an odd implication right there. And the amnesiac killer. What if, or, you know, what if in Severance, the one at work commits a crime and then leaves and doesn't remember it? Well, you cannot arrest the one outside because even if it's the body that did the crime, it's not the same person. And Locke was okay with that. He said, obviously, human courts are going to have a trouble with this, but God will know. On the day of judgment, Nightman will not be punished for Dayman's crimes. 2 death dates. This is actually true for Nancy Cruzan. And there was a mention of this in the reading, the previous one, the Mannanen reading, where she talks about Nancy Cruzan. Nancy Cruzan, as I said, had a catastrophic brain bleed and lost all awareness, and basically her brain died, except for the part of your brain which is the brain stem that regulates functions in your body. So her lungs and heart still worked, but she couldn't think anymore. And you know, her parents had to fight for a long time to say that it's not murder to unplug her, because she is the person, not the body. They eventually succeeded, like at least 7 years later, and when they buried her, they said died, and they put the date that she had, where her brain died, and then she said at peace. They said at peace when they finally unplugged her. So they gave her 2 death dates. The death date of the person, which isn't really a biological death, it's just the end of her existence. And then the date that the body finally was unplugged and was allowed to die. Again, Locke is totally okay with that. He says we're human. Most of us, right now, I am both human and person. The person is more important, but, you know, I've got a body. A nice kind of cool implication is, and this is another TV show, not as cool as Severance, but funnier, is a show called Upload on Amazon Prime. And it plays with this idea. That is, basically, if I am my memories, well, imagine that you could scan the contents of my brain and store it in a computer and enable the computer somehow to access those memories. Because I'm not simply my memories. I am my memories while they're active, while they're being remembered. There has to be something that is remembering them. You can't just store the data and say, that's me. But if there's somebody who's aware of my memories, then it looks like that person is me. So in Upload, if you pay for it, you can go into a sort of virtual world where you're like an AI with your memories. And, you know, you get to, if you pay a lot, you get a lot of memory, and you get a very luxurious afterlife, and you can interact with other people who've died and whose memories have been uploaded. So that would be a way to be immortal, because it's the memories that are important. All right, so there are weird implications, but they're not weird enough to undercut the theory. They're just, this is a strange thing that's true, like finding out that the Earth is in fact round and that we go round the sun, or it's weird, but it's true. Critics of Locke say, hang on a minute, it's not just weird, it doesn't make sense. It can't be true. So I'm looking at the pros and cons of this idea. The pros are it gets the right answer, or the answer that everybody agrees with in the brain transplant case. So if you believe that you are a person and that we have psychological persistence conditions, then you would say that this person who says he's Bert, even though he's got Fred's body, is right, because the correct judge of who he is the individual themselves. And if they have all of Bert's memories and they think they're Bert, they are Bert. Doesn't matter that they've now acquired a new body. So the pros for this theory is it does seem to agree with most people when presented with this case. Cons. Most famous criticism of the idea that what makes this person the same as this person as this person is remembering is, and I'm redrawing their faces here. This the most famous version of this is by a guy called Thomas Reid, who wrote about 100 years after Locke. And he said, imagine an old general who remembers when he was a young soldier, and when the young soldier remembers when he was a boy. The boy stole some apples from an orchard, got caught and thrashed. The young soldier was very brave on the battlefield and captured the enemy's flag. So the old general remembers capturing the flag. Okay, so given that the old general remembers being the young soldier, by the memory criterion, B is C. And you could say B equals C. You can say they're one and the same individual. And given that B remembers being A, then B equals A. So B equals C and B equals A, which when you put that together, anyone who knows basic math, means that A equals C. Because identity, which is the equals, is transitive. That just means that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. That's transitivity. The trouble is, memory is not transitive. That is, C remembers being B, but the problem is the old general has forgotten his life as a boy. So given by the memory criterion, in order to be someone, you have to remember them. So because C doesn't remember being A, they're not the same. So this is giving two inconsistent answers. Because C remembers being B and B remembers being A, it's telling us that A and C must be one and the same. They can't be anything else. If A and B are the same and B and A are the same, C and A have to be the same. So it's telling us that. But it's also, because C doesn't remember being A, telling us that they're not the same. If you give two contradictory answers, your theory is nonsense. It literally doesn't make sense. So that's a very serious criticism. It's not that the theory is weird, it's that it doesn't even make sense. Another famous criticism is, if you say you are what you remember, then you can't make sense of the notion of false memories. Because you're saying the only judge of who you are is you. And if you say, I remember shooting JFK, I remember being on the grassy knoll, most people would say, well, no, that's a false memory. But in order to make sense of a false memory, you have to say it's a memory you have that didn't happen to you. But the trouble with the memory criterion is you are your memories. So they can't say, they can't make sense of the idea of a memory that didn't happen to you, because you are your memories. So the memory criterion can't make sense of false memories. But we think that false memories happen. And even if you think they don't happen in everyday life, turns out memory is very tricky. It's very easy to implant a false memory in people. They've done psychology experiments. It's very easy to get you to remember something that didn't happen. So that's worrying. If a theory says if you remember being Napoleon, then you are Napoleon, that seems like a major problem for the theory. Another problem is, I don't remember when I was fast asleep last night. Does that mean I cease to exist? Do I cease to exist while unconscious because I have no memory of it? I mean, there's vast swathes of my life that I don't have memory of. Like driving to work. Most people don't even store memories for after a while, unless they hit a deer or something. But if you're doing something that you've done regularly, you just don't remember it. Does that mean you cease to exist then? Well, while you were doing that, though, you were having memories of time in the past. Probably that's what you were thinking of while you were driving in your boring drive to work. So it seems like there was a person that remembered being you in the past, but now you don't remember that person. So again, it seems like it's both you and not you. It's a problem. It's a whole mess. However, people who want to save the idea that we have a person says, no, the problem is not with the idea that we're a person. The problem is that the memory criterion is just too simplistic. So there's a more sophisticated version. And actually a lot of interpreters of Locke say, well, this is really what Locke was thinking. This is too simplistic a version for Locke. And that is just the idea that this person is the same as this person if there's a causal link between this person's mental states, their psychology, not just their memories, but their personality and everything. If this person's mental states were caused by someone who is caused by someone who is caused by this one, then they're the same one. Even if this person doesn't remember being that one, it doesn't matter. Their personality and their mental states, there's a causal chain going back to it. So in other words, to solve this problem, they would say C is A, because in order for C to be A, they don't have to directly remember it. All that has to be true for C to be A is for C's mental states to be caused by somebody's who are caused by A's. And we've already seen that that's true. So that solves that criticism if you say that in order to be the same person, you just have to trace a causal chain back. And that actually allows us, so say for example, I can own my earliest memories at age 5. I can still be a 4-year-old, I can still be the same as a baby because my 5-year-old's memories were caused by a 4-year-old's, were caused by a 3-year-old's, were caused by, so I go back as far as the first time I start making memories, or I start, consciousness begins. So if you swap the memory criterion for this one, I go back further in time, past the point I can remember to the very earliest memories. I still stop existing when if a brain bleed happens, because consciousness is still important. So the pros for this view is that it fits most people's intuitions. Most people agree with this. There are a bunch of more science fiction-y problems with this. Here's one. And this is one of the nice ideas that seems to be possible if a person in the future is me because their mental contents are caused by me, wouldn't exist if it wasn't for me. One of the nice ideas of that is this one, that I could be immortal. It doesn't have to be in the same brain. I don't have to, so long as the mental contents were caused by my ideas, it doesn't matter if my brain has slowly been replaced by an artificial one, like Theseus's ship. You replace a neuron with an artificial neuron, and slowly over the course of time it becomes entirely artificial without disrupting the memory and the personality. If that was possible, sure, that could be me. Another nice idea is that maybe we could use Star Trek transporters, and this is discussed in the Stephen Law article, because a Star Trek transporter, it destroys this body, scans all the information, and then makes a perfect new one with a sort of 3D printer at your destination. And, including every single, so it's like an identical copy of this, including all the same memories and personality. It seems like that would be me because it's copying the original. It only exists because of the original, so it fits the causal chain idea. So we could use Star Trek transporters. And when I ask people this in classes, would you use the transporter? A lot of people say, sure, you know, I wouldn't have to go on a plane. I could travel to the moon and come back in 10 seconds. Sounds great. But then if you alter the story and you say, okay, imagine you get in the booth, you press the button, and normally what happens is you get this weird feeling and then you're in Hawaii or wherever it was you wanted. But this time you press the button, you get the weird feeling, and then you see on a little camera, you're still in Flint, or wherever you are, you see on a little camera a picture of the copy of you being made in Hawaii. And then it's completed, and it starts whistling and leaves the booth to explore Hawaii. And then on the control it says, original destruct mechanism temporarily offline, coming back online in 3, 2, 1. And you realize what's about to happen is that this is going to be destroyed. Do you say, oh, well, that's okay because I'm already in Hawaii? No, you think, uh-oh, I'm about to be killed, and that's just a copy of me. That's not really me. It has to, you realize it has to have your body in order to be you, and you panic. And you realize that if you've used this transporter before, and this is the point of the end of the chapter of Stephen Law, you were killed. And the person that resulted that thought it was you wasn't really you. It was just a clone that thought it was you, but it wasn't you. That intuition seems to side with, oh, the body is important. You have to have the original body. So that's a contrary intuition from this one. This one, most people's intuitions say that we're the person. The faulty transporter, it sounds like, oh, the body is important too. There's also the problem of duplication, and this is the little story you and yours. What if you use the transporter and there's two of you? They can't both be you. So which one is? And the answer is that psychological theorists have come up with is, well, if duplication happens, then that means neither of them is you. So you cease to exist if duplication happens. But the weird thing is, if either of them are the only ones, then they're you. But if both of them exist, then neither of them is, and you cease to exist. So, but it's exactly the same thing happens in each case. So if I disappear and this one appears in the booth, that is me. If I disappear and this other one appears, then it is me. But if I disappear and both things happen, then I cease to exist. Why? Parfit, a famous philosopher to write on this, said, how can double success be a failure? That doesn't make sense. His response to this is to say, sure, the logic of identity, the equal sign, means that there can only be one of me at any moment. But what that means is that identity isn't what matters. Now, it seems like it is what matters. So you say, like, if I tell you there's going to be two people tomorrow, one of them will be you, and one of them will be tortured. You want to know, well, which one am I? I want to know if I'm the one being tortured. So you want to know who am I, and that's the sort of notion of identity. Parfit says, no, all that matters is whether or not they remember. And if there's 20 people, if we make 20 copies of you and they all remember, they all have your memories, that's great. That's even better because there's more. The more the merrier. Stop wondering which one is me. It doesn't matter. Identity doesn't matter. What matters is that you continue, that your psychological life continues into the future. Most people have a problem with that. David Lewis had another suggestion, and he said that if you divide, actually, what that means is that before you divided, there were two of them existing in you, because he says, actually, we are not three-dimensional beings. We are four-dimensional beings. So Lewis's view says, this is not 100% of me. It is a tiny slice of me. It is, so we think of ourselves as three-dimensional beings. That is, I exist entirely right now in 3 dimensions. Lewis says that's the wrong way to think about it. This whole thing is you. This is all of you. And at each point, that's just a part of you, a slice of you. Imagine you're a giant salami extending through time. This is like a slice of the salami existing in a second time. So he says, now, just as the freeway in Flint, the 69 and the 23 merge at one point, and there's a stretch of freeway that is both the 69 and the 23. Does that mean that the 69 and 23 aren't two different roads? No, they are two different roads, but they share a part. They share a stretch. And that's perfectly okay. Two different things can share a part. And he says that's what happens if you divide. The stretch of time right up to the point at which you divide is where two different things are sharing the part. And then they go their different ways and they stop sharing. And he says each of them, so you can keep the notion of personal identity. You just have to have the idea that this body can be part of two different people. Fun stuff. Not enough time to go into any details. Then there's the two thinkers or fetus problem. Now, I have actually interviewed Erik Olson, and I have read his books, and he thinks this is a knockdown criticism of personhood, and it just doesn't really trigger my intuitions. So I am not the best person to present this problem, but I will give it my best shot. Here's the way I understand it. So everybody agrees, Locke and everyone agrees, that you're not a person, at least for the early stage, at least the first trimester, or probably most of your time in utero, because your brain hasn't fully formed. So here is an organism. It's certainly an organism. It's a living thing. It's not a person. Now, this thing exists. And then if you believe that you are essentially a person, you start to exist. Now, humans don't, people who are persons think that they are physical objects. So both the animalist and the personalist believe that this is them. But their reason for saying that this is them is different. The personalist says this is mine because this physical object can remember or has a psychological connection. But it's the physical object that has the memories, so it is you. So both of them say that this thing is you. Now, at this point when the person starts, if I'm a person, as I say, that's where I begin. Olson says, well, what happened to the fetus? That's not you. This is you. You're not here. Here you are. What happened to this? Where did that go? Did it become you? But if you believe that you're essentially, that things that are just organisms are essentially organisms. So a plant is essentially a plant. A fetus, if it's just an organism, is essentially a fetus. So or is essentially a human. Where did that go? It was replaced by something that is not essentially an organism, that is essentially a person. But, where did it go? If it stayed, then there's two things there. Now this organism that started out as a fetus can think. So there are two things existing, you the person and this fetus continuing to exist. They can both think. So when one of them thinks, I am essentially a person, which one is it? This is the puzzle as best I can present it. Now, he thinks that means that you should be an animalist. And the pros of that view are that you can say, I was a fetus. You can't say that if you're a person, because fetuses are not persons, they don't have the brains. Now, that's a major plus, and also that it doesn't have the two thinkers problem. Major cons are it just doesn't get the right answer in the brain swap problem. It has a problem a bit like the fetus problem, because animalists, as the prefix anima implies, which means living, say that I am essentially not just a physical object, but a living thing. I am an organism and I have to be alive. So according to animalists, I stop existing there. But This physical object doesn't. It takes a long time to disappear. Starts stinking, slowly dissolves, but there's something there. It doesn't just pop and disappear. So where did this corpse appear from? You cease to exist, and then there's a corpse there. Where did the corpse come from? So just as, animalists say the personalists have a problem of saying, where did the fetus go? Animalists have a problem of where did the corpse come from? Okay, conjoined twins. This is a biggie. Conjoined twins, one type of conjoining, and there's I've forgotten the name of the famous twins, but it's a pair of girls. So they're identical twins, but they didn't divide fully. So what happens is they have two heads growing off basically a single body. I think they've only got two arms and two legs. But they regard themselves as two different people. They get into fights, they disagree, but they share organs. It seems pretty clear that they're a single organism. Like if one of them had a heart attack, they both have a heart attack. So according to animalism, there's only one individual there. Because there's how many individuals are? Count the number of organisms. There's one. But most people would agree there's two individuals there. And a personalist can say, I can tell you why there's two, because there's two persons. So in terms of counting the individuals, animalism seems to get conjoined twins wrong. Well, a way to try and split the difference is to say, well, I'm not a whole organism, I'm a brain. And this means this gets the right answer in the brain transplant question. And it also gets the right answer in the conjoined twins, because there's two different brains, so two different individuals. There are some weirdnesses of this. If I asked you how much do you weigh, your answer would be 3 to 5 pounds, because that's the weight of a brain. Is your brainstem part of you? Can that be replaced? That's an open question, because a brainstem enables you to be conscious, but isn't itself conscious. Brains are still physical objects, so they can be dead. Is that still you if it's dead? If I keep a brain preserved in preservatives, is that still you? Because you are a brain. Finally, you can also have the problem of duplication that you have in personhood with brains. You can have a physical, duplication is usually called fission, which means dividing. I called it duplication in the case of persons because it does look like you're being entirely copied. Whereas fission is actually a better description of what goes on with brains, as I will explain now. I've just been reminded that the famous conjoined twins are the Hensel twins. I don't know how old they are. I'm pretty sure they're still alive. You can look them up, Hensel. One of them is called Abigail. Back to fission. Okay. This will take a few minutes. Epilepsy. Everybody knows what epilepsy is. It's electrical activity in your brain. Turns out that if you have really severe epilepsy, one way of stopping it is to sever the corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum is a bundle of nerves that joins the two hemispheres of your brain. And the idea is that the epileptic seizures get worse by bouncing from one hemisphere to the other and somehow amplifying. And if you can stop the process by severing the sort of highway that they travel down, which is the corpus callosum, then this solves the worst kinds of epilepsy. Now, it's a last resort, and they don't do it anymore. It's called commissurectomy or something. But they did it in the 60s, and it seemed to work. It seemed to help people whose lives were basically not worth living because they were having constant grand mal seizures. Now they could live a fairly normal life. But the weird thing is, these people appeared to have two consciousnesses. And the way they demonstrated this was they made it so that this eye could only see one color and this eye could only see another. And your left eye basically is associated with your right hemisphere and your right eye is associated with your left hemisphere. And same with the hands. So one eye is associated with one arm, the other eye is associated with the other arm with one hemisphere. So here's an experiment they did. They showed two colors, red and blue, to one individual, except that one eye could only see red and the other eye could only see blue. And they put a pen in each hand and they said, write how many colors you see. And they both wrote 1. So what they knew is that this eye was seeing the red, or let's say seeing the red, and this eye was seeing the blue, but they weren't seeing the other color. So now, the person as a whole could see both colors, because one eye could see red and the other eye could see blue. So if the hemispheres could communicate, they would have written 2. But because they couldn't, they were both writing 1. And then they said, write what color you see. And one wrote red and the other wrote blue. So each hemisphere was independently spotting the color and able to communicate. It sounds like there are 2 people in your head. And in fact, some people argue that there's at least one person who argues that everybody has 2 people in them. Every human being has 2 people in them. Now, let's imagine that the brains are fairly symmetrical. It turns out most people have different tasks assigned to different hemispheres, but it varies between people, and some people can have symmetrical brains. Most people, their left hemisphere is the one that can talk. So if you have a stroke in your left hemisphere, you have to relearn how to talk, but you can do it. Maybe not fully, maybe not well, but you can. But if you have a stroke in your left hemisphere, until you relearn, you can't speak, because that was in charge of speaking. But imagine you've got symmetrical hemispheres, and you do that. And imagine you have 3 triplets, and they're traveling in a car together, and 2 of them, their heads are squashed, and one of them, the rest of their body is squashed. So this one is just a head and a mangled body, and these have perfectly good bodies, but their brains have been destroyed. A guy called David Wiggins imagined something like this. You take the left hemisphere and put it in this one, and you take the right hemisphere and put it in this one. Now, if one hemisphere survives, you survive. People who've had a stroke and destroyed their hemisphere, we say, but one hemisphere works, we say that that person survives. So if either hemisphere survived by itself, this person, A, would have survived. But now both of them have survived, and both of them can go off and live separate lives. You get the same problem as with duplication. Is A B? Well, but if A equals B, then A cannot equal C, because B and C are different. So B does not equal C. So can A equal B? Well, if A equals B, then he's not C. But he or she has exactly the same connection with C. So this is a case of where you get the same duplication problem. And then what do we say about that? One guy who's tried to split the difference between these 2 camps is a writer called Jeff McMahon. I've also interviewed him, like Eric Olson. And he calls his theory embodied mind. He says, you are the person existing in the brain. So the brain has to survive and the memories have to survive, essentially. There are some other differences with the person. I'm not going to go into it. I've got a video on that if you're interested. But basically, that doesn't allow upload because you need the original brain. So it's sort of a combination of the 2. And he thinks that sort of solves the problems. But as you can see, it's a fascinating topic, and philosophers love talking about this stuff. The issues that make it relevant to our course is you need to know who it is that you are to know when you cease to exist. Do you die if you cease to be capable of consciousness, or do you continue to live on a respirator? Which of them is you? Now, and this also involves questions of rights if you're a person, and also questions of what lives we should value. Should we value this life of somebody who is a human but not a person? Or once the person stops, does that mean we can do what we like with the human being? Can we harvest them for organs? This is an important issue, and we'll be getting into some of those issues later in the class.